Hi everyone, welcome to Salesforce Topics channel. In this session, let us discuss about an important Salesforce topic, that is trigger. The entire trigger concept I have divided into 6 sessions. In the first session, we are going to see what is the trigger, what is the syntax of the trigger, and what are all the trigger events that we have, and what are all the trigger context variables and their corresponding values for each and every trigger event. And from the second session onwards, we will see the examples on each and every trigger event. So in this session, we are going to see what is a trigger, trigger syntax, trigger events, and for each and every trigger events, how Salesforce is giving the trigger context variables and its values. So first of all, what is a trigger? Trigger allows us to execute our custom logic on or before DML operation on a record. So if you want to perform your custom functionality before inserting an record, or if you want to perform any operation after inserting an record, or otherwise if you want to perform your custom functionality before updating a record or after updating a record, and sometimes we may require to perform your custom functionality after deletion of the record or before deleting the record. For all these kinds of requirement, it is better to go for the triggers. We will cover all these kinds of requirements in our demo sessions. So first see what are all the DML operations that we have in Apex. Those are insert, update, delete, undelete, upsert, and merge. If you see, upsert is ultimately leads to either insert or update, and merge leads to the update and delete. So core DML operations are only 4, that is insert, update, delete, and undelete. We have trigger events and trigger context variables only for these core DML operations, that is for insert, update, delete, and undelete. For upsert and merge, we do not have any separate trigger events or trigger context variables, as upsert is ultimately leading it to the insert or update, and merge is ultimately leads to update and delete core operations. In Salesforce triggers, we have 3 core concepts, that is a trigger syntax, trigger events, and trigger context. First, we will see the syntax of the trigger. The syntax of trigger is very simple, that is trigger followed by a trigger name on followed by a subject name on which you are going to define this trigger, and then within brackets we have to mention the trigger events. The list of trigger events are going to be before insert, before update, after update, before delete, after delete, after undelete. If you observe, for all of the 4 DML operations, we have before event and after event, but except for undelete, we have only after event. We do not have before undelete event. We will come to know on the reason why we do not have before undelete trigger event in our upcoming slides. Then the next important concept in the trigger is trigger context variables. These are all the list of trigger context variables that we have for the triggers. We can divide all of these trigger context variables into the sections. The first section depends on the type of the DML operation. That is insert, is update, is delete, is undelete. And the second section is about the type of event. The type of event either can be before or after, that is before trigger events or after trigger events. The next section is to hold the new values, that is in the list format and in the map format, followed by a section which holds the old values in the list format and the map format. Then operation type, based on the event type, the corresponding operation type we will have. The size is going to be the number of records that is participating in the DML operation. The final Boolean variable is executing is true whenever the current context is triggered, and if the current context is Visual Force or web service, then the is executing flag would be false. In general, we are going to have our code inside this block, trigger block, but instead of writing entire our logic here within the trigger block, it is better to take the trigger handlers, and over there we can write our methods so that we will get the complete features of the class, and those handlers can be used by these triggers or Visual Force pages or web services. And if those handlers are being used by Visual Force page or web service, that time this is executing flag will be a false. And if those trigger handlers are used by trigger, then the current context is related to the trigger. So in that case, is executing will become true. This is executing flag is mainly to differentiate whether the trigger handler is being called from the trigger or Visual Force page or web service. If you observe here, I have taken the default values for Boolean and list map, but the values of these trigger context variables depends on the type of trigger event that we are handling. For example, for before insert, the values would be different. For after insert, the values are going to be different. Likewise, each event, we will have a different set of values. The list of variables are common, only the values are going to be changed based on the trigger event type. We would take each and every event and see what are all the corresponding values that we get from the Salesforce and how Salesforce is able to give us these values for each and every trigger event. In order to understand the trigger concepts clearly, it is better to understand the Salesforce order of execution for the DML operations. For example, here I have taken an insert DML operation. That is, we are inserting a record into the custom object, that is service underscore request underscore underscore C with a name Vijay's vehicle. Salesforce starts the initialization of records data. This initialization of record contains two steps. The first one is it fetches the data from the database. For example, in this case, as a first step, for the service request object, it tries to fetch from the database, but it don't find anything from the database. So the service request object from the database would be empty. As a second step, it overrides the inputted values. That is, here we are mentioning the name is equal to Vijay's vehicle. So our service request object is going to have the name as Vijay's vehicle. Ultimately, the initialized record data is combines the data from the DB and user input. After initialization of record, the Salesforce performs the system validation rules. For example, all the required fields are available or not, or the format of the fields are proper or not, etc. After system validation rules, it executes before triggers. We will see in detail on this before triggers for each and every trigger event. After this, Salesforce will call the again system validations, because in the before triggers again the data may be modified. That is why Salesforce again performs the system validations as well as the custom validation rules. Then it checks the duplicate rules. After this step, Salesforce saves that record into the DB. Please note that here the record gets saves into the DB, but it doesn't commit yet. For example, in our case, we are going to insert a custom objects record with a name Vijay's vehicle. During this save, it will get a system generated IDs created by ID, owner ID, last modified by ID, and it saves those data into the DB. Please note that this is not yet committed. That is why it is visible only to within this transaction, and this record is not yet available to others This record will be available to others or other transactions only when it got committed. At this point of time, since it has not yet committed, it is only available to this current transaction. This is an important concept to understand the triggers clearly. That is, it just saves, it doesn't commit it. Then after this save operation, system executes the after triggers. We will see in detail on execute after triggers in our upcoming slides. Then after this step, Salesforce performs the assignment, workflow, escalation rules, etc. Then after that, it commits DML into the DB. That means here at this point of time, this saved record is going to get commit and it will be visible to all others. Since the record got committed at this step, this record is visible to all from now on. After this, Salesforce executes post-commit activities. The main thing that we need to observe here is at this step, Salesforce only saves the data, it will not commit, and after this, it will have the commit DB. And around this operation, that is save operation only, we have before triggers and after triggers, but not around the commit DML. That means the before triggers are coming before save operation, after triggers are coming after save operation within same transaction. Please note that the order of the steps that we have seen here are going to be within under same transaction. And also note that I have depicted here only the steps that are essential to understand our trigger concept clearly. Salesforce has many other steps in the order of execution in this sequence, but I have selected only the steps that are required for our triggers. Now let us see for each and every trigger event how Salesforce is going to populate trigger context variables. First, we will take a look into the before insert trigger event. Before insert trigger event gets fired before saving inserted data into the database. That means it gets fired over here at this step, that is before saving the record. So in order to see how Salesforce is populating the trigger context variables, let us take one example where we are going to insert one service request with the name Vijay's vehicle into the service request custom object. So let us see the order of execution. When it saves, it doesn't commit. That's why we are not able to see the record yet here. And when it commits, we are able to see the record here. And as we are looking for the before insert trigger event, let's concentrate on this step. At this step, if you see, the data is not yet committed because the transaction is at execution of the before triggers. So at this step right now, because the transaction has not reached the commit step, so still the data is not there in the database. And for the before insert, the trigger context variables are going to have these kind of values, like operation type is going to have before underscore insert for before insert event, and the type of the event is before. That is why is before is assigned as true, is after is assigned as false. And then the four values, the boolean values, depends on the type of the DML. Here the type of the DML is insert. That is why is insert will get assigned with a true. Remaining three values will get assigned as false. The next section is about the new values in the list format and new map format. In order to give the new values in the list format and new map format, Salesforce looks for the inputted data. That is, here we have given the input with the name as Vijay's vehicle. This will be populated into the new and new map. The values in the new and new map are going to be like this. Here ID of the record is still null because it has not reached the record save step yet. Since it does not have ID yet, Salesforce cannot give us in the map format. The next section is to have the old values, that is in the list format and in the ID, object map format. Salesforce always fetches the old data from the database. Since the corresponding data is not yet committed into the database, it does not find anything in the database, so it will give null as a values for the old and old map. The size is going to be the 1 here because we are inserting only one record as part of this trigger execution. Is executing flag is true because the current transaction whichever we are discussing here is being executed by a trigger. This flag is useful if the same handler is used for the trigger and Visualforce page and web services. In order to identify whether this handler is being called from a trigger or web service or Visualforce, we have this flag. If this flag is true, then this handler is being called from a trigger. Like this, Salesforce populate all the values for the trigger context variables for the before insert, and it gives to the our logic custom code that we implement for the before insert. So in the custom code, we can make use of these values for the before insert. Since the record is not yet saved and not yet committed, we can assign the values to this record that is being inserted. That means we can access this new list variable and we can process each and every record. We can update the values if you want. And also we can perform if any validations on the given data. If you identify any validation issues in the record, then you can add an error to the record so that it will not continue to the next steps and we can roll back the transaction from here itself. And if everything is okay, if there is no validation issues, after our code execution, the next steps gets executed. This is the scenario with the before insert. Let's look into the after insert trigger event. After insert trigger event gets fired after saving the record data into the database. That means after insert trigger event gets fired at this step after the save step. To see how Salesforce populates the trigger context variable for after insert trigger event, we will take the same insert statement for the same data to insert this record into the DB. Let us see the order of execution. At the save, you will not be able to see the record yet. Only after commit only you will see the record in the database. Since we are looking for the after insert trigger event, it gets fires here. So let's concentrate on this step. At this step, if you observe, the record is not yet committed into the database. That is why in the database, we are not able to see the record. Of course, it has saved the record, but it is not yet committed. That is why other transactions cannot see this record in the database yet. So for the after insert, the trigger context variables are going to have these values. The operation type as after underscore insert, and this event type is after is going to set as a true, is before is going to set as false. And these four boolean variable values depends on the type of the DML. Here the type of the DML is insert. That is why is insert is going to set as true. Remaining three boolean values will get assigned as false. The next section is the new and new map values. To provide the new and new map values, Salesforce looks for the input data. For the input data, if you see, we have given the name, but at this save step, Salesforce has assigned the generated record ID and created by ID, owner ID, last modified ID. So By this time, our record has ID too. So the new values would look like, if you observe, this got the ID because of the save step that is performed before this after insert trigger event happens. Since it has an ID, Salesforce can give us in the map format too. That is ID as the key and the record as a value. The next section is for the old values. To provide the old values, Salesforce always checks in the database. In this case, Salesforce cannot find any record in the database for the record that we are inserting. So here it is going to give us the null for the old and old map. Size is 1 here because we are inserting only one record over here. Is executing is true because the current transaction whichever we are discussing here is being caused by a trigger code. Like this, Salesforce populates all the trigger context variables values for the after insert trigger event. In our code, we can make use of these trigger context variables and its values, and we can write our custom code using these variables and values. Please note that here all the values new map, old map are read only. New and new map are also read only because the new values whichever we have in this new and new map are already saved by this step. Again, it will not allow us to modify the data. The old and old map are read only because Salesforce fetched the data from the database for the record that is currently being inserted. Even here with our custom code, if we find any issues, we can roll back the transaction by adding the error to the record. After execution of our custom code, it continues for the remaining steps. We have seen how Salesforce is populating the trigger context variable values for the after insert and before insert. In the same way, let us look into the before update and after update events. Before update event gets fired before saving the updated data into the database. That means, let's assume that this order of execution is for updating the record. So at this step, the before update trigger event gets fired. That is before even saving the updated data into the database. To see how Salesforce is going to populate the trigger context variable values for the before update, let's consider a scenario where we are updating the name of the service request from the Vijay's vehicle to Vijay's car. With this update statement where we are passing the ID and the updated name. First, let us see the order of execution. As we know, when it saves, you will not be able to see the update here. Only after it commit, you will be able to see in the database, the updated value in the database. As we are looking for the before update trigger event, let us concentrate on this step only. So at this point of time, still the database has the old value for the name. And for before update, Salesforce is going to give us the trigger context variables and its values as like this. Operation type is going to be before underscore update for the before update event. As this event is a before event, is before flag set to true, is after flag is set to false. These four Boolean variables values depends on the type of the DML. Here the type of the DML is update. So is update is going to set as true. Remaining three Boolean values will get assigned as false. The next section is for the new values in the list format and map format. In order to give the new value, Salesforce always looks for the inputted data. That is, here we have given the ID and name. So at this point of time, whatever Salesforce can give us from the request, that values would be populated into the new and new map. So at this point of time, it can populate the data whichever we have given with ID. So since it has an ID too, it can give us in the map format too. Here please observe that the new values, that is new and new map, are not read only for the before events, because the before event is occurs before to the save operation, actual save operation. So we can update the values of the record here using the new or new map values. For example, if you want to add any value to the record, that you can access it from the new or new map and update the data. Next section is for the old and old map data. Salesforce always populates the old data from the database. In this scenario, for the record that we are going to update, it can find the data that is already committed data. So it will populate this old data to the old list and old map. That is why if you see the old and old map values, it has the old name, that is Vijay's vehicle. Size is 1 here, as we are updating only one record here. Is executing flag is assigned as true because whatever the transaction that we are talking about here is being executed by a trigger. Like this, Salesforce populates the values of each and every trigger context variable for the before update trigger event. We can implement our requirement by using these values in our custom code. And after execution of our custom code, the next steps are going to execute. Now let's look into the after update trigger event. The after update trigger event gets fired after saving the record updated data into the database. That is, consider this order of execution is to update the record data, and after update trigger event gets fired at this step. That is, after save operation performed. Now let us see how Salesforce is going to populate trigger context variable values for the after update trigger event. For this, we will take the same example that we are going to update the name of the service request from Vijay's vehicle to Vijay's car. So here, as earlier we have seen, this transaction would get saved here, but you will not be able to see the change yet, but you will see the change after commit. As we are discussing about the after update trigger event, let us concentrate on this step only. At this step, if you see, the record that has in the database still have the old data because it is not yet committed. Of course, it saved the data, but it is not visible to others. And for after update, Salesforce is going to give us the trigger context variable and its values as like this. Operation type is going to be assigned as after underscore update for the after update event. As this event type is after flag is assigned as true, is before is assigned as false. The value of these four boolean variables is depends on the type of the DML. So here the type of the DML is update. So is update gets assigned as true, remaining all are gets assigned as false. The next section is going to be for the new values in the list format and map format. As we know, Salesforce gives us the new values from the request data, that is whichever we have given in the request data. Here we have given the ID and a name, so it can populate both the values, that is in the list format and map format, because it has an ID. And observe that it has the new value whichever we are going to update. Also please note that these new values are read only because it is an after event. The actual reason why Salesforce marked it as a read only is It has given us the new values after performing the save operation into the database. That means it is already saved the data. Again, it will not allow us to modify the data. The next section is going to be for the old list and old map to give the old values. To give the old values, Salesforce always refers the database. From the database, it identifies that for the given update statement, there is the data, that is, it has the ID in the database. So it can fetch the values, old values, and give us in the list format and map format. Observe that old and old map both has the data with the old values, whichever available in the database at this point of time. Size is 1 here because we are updating only one record over here. Is executing flag is true because whichever transaction we are discussing about here is being executed by a trigger. Like this, Salesforce populates all the trigger context variable values for the after update trigger event. Using these values, we can implement our custom logic for the after update. After execution of our custom logic, the next steps are going to be executed. Now let us see the trigger events for the delete DML operation, that is before delete and after delete. The before delete events gets fired before saving the deletion of data from database. That is, assume that this order of execution is for the delete DML. Please note that the order of execution for the DMLs are common for all the types of DML operations. Now let us consider this order of execution is for delete DML operation. Then before delete gets fired at this step, that is before even saving into the database. Now let us see how Salesforce will populate the trigger context variable values for the before delete event. Let us take a scenario where we are going to delete this record, whichever we inserted in earlier scenario. That record we are going to delete by passing the ID. Now let's see the order of execution for this delete DML operation. And as you know, at this step, save step, it will not get deleted. Only after commit step, it will get deleted from the database. Since we are looking for the before delete trigger event, just concentrate on this step for now. So at this point of time, if you see, this record has not yet been deleted from the database. So at this point of time, Salesforce gives us the trigger context variables and its values like this for the before delete trigger event. Operation type is going to be the before underscore delete. As the type of the event is before flag gets assigned as true, is after is assigned as false. The values of these four variables would depend on the type of the DML operation. Here the type of the DML operation is delete. That is why is delete is getting assigned as true. Remaining three boolean values is getting assigned as false. The next section is going to be for the new and new map. In order to provide the new values, Salesforce looks for the input data. And here the input data is having only the ID. So Salesforce cannot find any data over here. That is why if you see, the Salesforce cannot give any value into the new and new map. Even if you have provided complete object to delete with values, Salesforce only takes the ID value for the delete DML operation. That is why here it is not able to provide any other data. It will provide us the new and new map values as null. And the next section is to have the old values. Salesforce gives us the old values from the database. At this point of time, still for the given ID, still the data is there in the database. So it can provide us the data that is available in the database into the old and old map. The size is 1 here because Here we are deleting only one record. Is executing flag is true here because whichever transaction that we are discussing here is caused by a trigger. Like this, Salesforce populates all the trigger context variable values for the before delete trigger event. Using these values, we can implement our custom requirement, and after execution of our custom code, the next steps will get executed. Now in the same way, let us see after delete trigger event and its corresponding trigger context variables. After delete trigger event gets fired after saving the deleted record into the database. That means after events gets triggered here. So after delete trigger event also gets fired here. That is after performing the save step. Now let us see how Salesforce is going to populate the trigger context variable values for the after delete trigger event. For this, again I am taking the same scenario that we are going to delete this record from the database by using the delete ID. The order of execution is same, and if you see at save, you will still see the record because it will not commit it. At the commit, you will see that data has been deleted. As now we are discussing about after delete trigger event, let us concentrate on this step for this order of execution. At this step, you would still see the record is still available because it has not yet committed, though it is saved the deletion into the database. For other transactions, the record is still exists because deletion is not yet committed. For after delete trigger event, Salesforce is going to give us the trigger context variables like this. Operation type is going to be after underscore delete. As the after delete is a type of after event, is after is getting assigned as true, is before is getting assigned as false. The value of these four Boolean variables depends on the type of the DML. Here the type of the DML is delete. So is delete is going to set as true. Remaining three Boolean variables values is going to set as false. The next section is for the new values in the list and map format. As we know, Salesforce tries to give the new map from the requested data. In this request, we could see only we have the ID and Salesforce cannot give us the any other details in the new map. So the values of the new maps are assigned as a null. And the next section is to have the old values in the list format and the map format. Salesforce populates the old values from the DB. So at this point of time, for the given record, Salesforce finds the record in the database. So those data would get populated into the old map. Size is 1 here because we are deleting only one record over here. Is executing is true here because the transaction whichever we are discussing here is being executed by a trigger. Please note that all these four values new map, old map are all read only for the after events. The reason is by this step Salesforce has already performed the save operation on that record, so it will not allow us to perform any modification on these values. And for old map, obviously it is taken from the database for the same record that we are operating, so it will not allow us to change anything on the old map. Like the Salesforce populates the trigger context values for the trigger context variables for after delete trigger event. We can implement our custom code using these trigger context variables and values. After execution of our custom code, the remaining steps will get executed. Now let us see the remaining trigger event, that is after undelete. After undelete trigger event gets fired after saving the recycled record into the database. To see how Salesforce is going to populate the trigger context variable values for the after undelete trigger event, let us consider a scenario. Here this is the deleted data which resides in the recycle bin. When you perform undelete with this ID, the Salesforce is going to fetch this data from the recycle bin and it commits to the our database. So let us see the order of execution. The order of execution is going to be same. Only thing is it takes the input from the recycle bin and it saves here, but it is not yet available in the DB. Only at the commit you will see the changes in the DB. Now after commit, the record has reached to the DB and it is being removed from the recycle bin. As we are discussing about after undelete, it happens at the execute after trigger step. So let us concentrate only on this step. At this step, it finds the after undelete. If you observe at this step, still the data has not reached to the database. It just saved into the database, but it is not committed. That is why it is not reached to the database. For after undelete, Salesforce populates the trigger context variable values like this. Operation type is going to be after underscore undelete. As the type of the event is after is set as true, is before is set as false. And the type of the DML operation is undelete here. So is undelete is going to set as true. Remaining boolean values are set as false. To populate the new values over here, Salesforce looks for the request data. Here we are providing only the ID, but when it reaches to the save operation, the undelete looks for the data into the recycle bin. From there it can fetch data and it gets saved into the database, but it doesn't commit it. Hence, at this point of time, you would be able to see the requested data will have the complete details whichever we have in the recycle bin. That is why Salesforce will be able to give us the new and new map values. Please note that the ID will never get changes if you perform the undelete operation. The ID whichever was available earlier before it got deleted this record and before it was moving to the recycle bin, the record will get restored with the same ID. As it is giving us the new values after performing the save operation, it marked it as a read only. To give the old values in the list and map format, Salesforce has to get from the database. At this point of time, still the database does not have any data for the given record ID. So Salesforce would populate only the null values for the old and old map. Size is 1 here because we are undeleting only one record in this transaction. Is executing flag is true because whichever the transaction that we are discussing right now is being caused by a trigger. Like this, Salesforce populates the values for the trigger context variables for the after undelete trigger event. After we have all this data, we can perform all the implementation logic in our custom code. After the execution of our custom code, the remaining steps would get executed. Now let us see why we do not have before undelete trigger event. When it reaches to this step, Salesforce does not have any values to provide into the new and new map because Salesforce retrieves the input data for the undelete statement only at the save operation level. So at this point of time, Salesforce does not have any data to give us in the list and map format, that is new and new map. So both are going to be null. And at the same time, at this step, Salesforce cannot give us the old values from the DB because the record is not yet reached the DB. And at this step, the values of the old and old map, it will give as null. So ultimately, the trigger context variables will look like this for the before and delete if it would have been there. And if you observe new and new map, both are going to be null and old map are going to be null. This is invalid data. With this data, we cannot perform much on the before undeleting the data, as we do not have anything to access from these variables. That is the reason we do not have before undelete trigger event. Thanks for watching. We will meet in the next session where we will discuss on the implementation part of the triggers with an examples.